The winter of 1945 was supposed to be the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Allied forces were advancing on all fronts, pushing toward the Rhine and preparing for the final assault into the German heartland. The partnership between the United States, Britain, and other Allied nations had weathered nearly 6 years of war, surviving disagreements over strategy, competing national interests, and clashing personalities. But in early January 1945, this carefully maintained unity came closer to complete collapse than at any time since the alliance had formed. At the center of this crisis was General George Patton, whose actions and words during the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge nearly destroyed the coalition that was on the verge of winning World War II. This is the story of how one press conference, delivered by a British field marshal with Patton's bitter complaints providing ammunition, almost tore apart the most important military alliance of the 20th century. To understand how close Allied unity came to collapse, we need to understand the fragile nature of the Anglo-American military partnership in World War II. This was an alliance born of necessity rather than natural affinity. Britain and the United States shared language and democratic values, but they had very different strategic priorities, different military traditions, and different visions for the post-war world. Britain was fighting for survival, defending an empire that was already beginning to crumble, led by Winston Churchill, who understood that British power was declining and that the war's outcome would determine how gracefully that decline occurred. America was fighting to defeat fascism and secure its position as a global superpower. Led by Franklin Roosevelt, who had his own vision of post-war order that didn't necessarily include continued British imperial dominance. These fundamental differences in national interest were papered over during the war by elaborate diplomatic protocols, by Eisenhower's extraordinary gifts as a coalition commander, and by the reality that both nations needed each other to defeat Germany. But beneath the surface of cooperation, tensions constantly simmered. American commanders resented what they saw as British condescension and reluctance to take risks. British commanders worried about American inexperience and tendency toward frontal assaults that wasted lives. Both sides competed for resources, for glory, and for influence over strategy. The British commander who personified these tensions was Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commander of 21st Army Group and the senior British Ground Forces commander in Northwest Europe. Montgomery was brilliant, methodical, and absolutely convinced of his own superiority to virtually every other commander on either side. He had defeated Rommel at El Alamein, commanded the British and Canadian forces on D-Day, and conducted successful operations in Normandy and the Low Countries. But he was also cautious to the point of timidity in American eyes, insufferably arrogant in his dealings with American commanders, and constantly maneuvering for greater authority and resources. Montgomery's relationship with American commanders ranged from cool to hostile. He got along reasonably well with Eisenhower, though he constantly lobbied for changes to Eisenhower's strategy. He had a difficult relationship with Omar Bradley, who commanded 12th Army Group and resented what he saw as Montgomery's self-promotion and attempts to claim credit for American achievements. But Montgomery's relationship with George Patton was pure mutual loathing. Montgomery represented everything Patton despised: excessive caution, concern with tidiness and proper procedures, willingness to sacrifice speed for security. Patton represented everything Montgomery feared: reckless aggression, disregard for proper military organization, and a talent for publicity that threatened to overshadow British contributions to the war. The crisis that nearly destroyed Allied unity began in mid-December 1944, when Germany launched its surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German attack crashed into American positions, creating a bulge in the Allied lines and threatening to split Bradley's 12th Army Group in two. The northern shoulder of the Bulge was held by 1st Army under General Courtney Hodges, while the southern shoulder was held by Patton's 3rd Army. Bradley's headquarters was south of the Bulge, and communication with 1st Army became difficult as German forces pushed westward. On December 20th, 1944, Eisenhower made a command decision that would set in motion the crisis that nearly destroyed the alliance. He temporarily transferred 1st Army and 9th Army from Bradley's command to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. The military logic was sound. Montgomery's headquarters had better communication with these armies given the disruption caused by the German offensive, and having a single commander coordinate the northern response to the attack made tactical sense. But the political and psychological implications were enormous and, in retrospect, not adequately considered. For Bradley, this transfer was a personal and professional humiliation. He was being, as he saw it, relieved of half his command in the middle of a crisis. The implication was that he couldn't handle the situation, that a British commander needed to step in to rescue American forces from disaster. Bradley was devastated and furious. He pleaded with Eisenhower to reconsider, arguing that the communication problems could be solved and that the command change would be seen as a lack of confidence in American leadership. Eisenhower overruled him, and the transfer was made effective immediately. Patton's initial reaction to the command change was complex. On one level, he was pleased to see Bradley humiliated, since Bradley was his superior and had frequently frustrated Patton's desire for more aggressive action. Patton had never forgiven Bradley for various perceived slights during their service together. But Patton was also an intensely patriotic American who despised the British in general, and Montgomery in particular. The idea of American forces being placed under British command offended his nationalist sensibilities and his professional pride. What Patton did in response to the command change would provide ammunition for the crisis that was coming. He began to openly criticize the decision in conversations with his staff, with war correspondents, and with anyone else who would listen. He suggested that the command change was unnecessary, that it reflected Eisenhower's weakness in dealing with the British, and that American forces were perfectly capable of handling the German offensive without British assistance. He made disparaging comments about Montgomery's competence and courage, suggesting that Montgomery was better at taking credit for other people's victories than at actually fighting. These comments, while made in what Patton thought were private conversations, inevitably leaked to journalists and began appearing in American newspapers. War correspondents who had been with 3rd Army during its race across France were sympathetic to Patton and shared his resentment of what they saw as British attempts to minimize American contributions to the war. Stories began appearing in the American press, questioning why American armies had been placed under British command, suggesting that this reflected British attempts to dominate the alliance, and reviving old accusations that Montgomery was overcautious and more interested in his own glory than in winning the war. Meanwhile, Montgomery was making his own mistakes that would turn a difficult situation into a full-blown crisis. With temporary command of 1st and 9th Armies, Montgomery did what he always did. He took his time, organized his forces methodically, and prepared a carefully planned counteroffensive. But more damagingly, he began to see the Battle of the Bulge through the lens of his long-standing argument that Allied strategy had been wrong, that Eisenhower's broad front approach had been a mistake, and that if Montgomery had been given the resources he requested for his own operations, the German offensive would never have happened. Montgomery shared these views with British political and military leaders, with journalists, and eventually with the public. He suggested that American commanders had been caught by surprise because they had been too aggressive, too spread out, and insufficiently concerned with maintaining solid defensive positions. He implied that British forces, under his leadership, were now cleaning up the mess that American overconfidence had created. These comments, when they reached American commanders, were incendiary. The suggestion that American forces needed British rescue, that American command decisions had been flawed, struck at American pride and threatened to unravel the carefully maintained fiction that the Anglo-American alliance was a partnership of equals. By early January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge was being contained and German forces were being pushed back, the tension between American and British commanders had reached a breaking point. American generals were furious about Montgomery's comments and about what they saw as British attempts to claim credit for stopping the German offensive. British leaders were frustrated by American criticism and what they saw as American unwillingness to acknowledge British contributions. Eisenhower was caught in the middle, trying to maintain unity while dealing with commanders on both sides who were barely speaking to each other. Then, on January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference that would become one of the most controversial moments of the entire war. Speaking to British and American journalists at his headquarters, Montgomery attempted to praise the performance of American troops during the Battle of the Bulge. But his manner and his choice of words created exactly the opposite impression. He spoke in a condescending tone about how he had taken command of American forces, straightened out the situation, and ensured that proper military procedures were followed. He used phrases like "headed off" and "seeing it through" that implied American forces had been in desperate straits until he arrived to save them. Most damagingly, Montgomery said that the Battle of the Bulge had been one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. The phrase, "I have ever handled," suggested that Montgomery, not the American commanders on the ground, or Bradley or Eisenhower, had been responsible for the victory. He went on to describe in detail his own actions and decisions, barely mentioning the American troops who had actually done the fighting or the American commanders who had led them. The overall impression created by the press conference was that British leadership had rescued American forces from disaster, that Montgomery was the hero of the Battle of the Bulge, and that American command had been found wanting. The reaction in the United States was explosive. American newspapers, already primed by Patton's criticisms and by resentment over the transfer of American armies to British command, unleashed furious editorials attacking Montgomery personally and questioning whether the Anglo-American alliance could continue if British commanders were going to treat American forces with such disrespect. Editorial writers demanded Montgomery's dismissal, or at least a formal repudiation of his comments. Columnists questioned why American soldiers should fight under British command if British commanders were going to claim credit for American sacrifices. More seriously, American military leaders began to question whether the alliance could or should continue. Bradley told Eisenhower that he could not and would not continue to serve if his forces remained under Montgomery's command. He said that if the command arrangements made during the Battle of the Bulge became permanent, he would request relief and return to the United States. Other American generals expressed similar sentiments. The American military establishment, from the War Department in Washington to commanders in the field, united in fury against Montgomery and against what they saw as British attempts to dominate the alliance. British leaders recognized that they had a crisis on their hands. Winston Churchill understood immediately that Montgomery's press conference had been a catastrophic mistake. Churchill knew that Britain needed the American alliance, that British power was insufficient to defeat Germany alone, and that alienating the Americans over Montgomery's ego was a strategic disaster. He moved quickly to contain the damage, preparing a speech to the House of Commons that would praise American contributions to the Battle of the Bulge and subtly repudiate Montgomery's claims. But the crisis had taken on a momentum of its own. George Patton, seeing an opportunity to both attack Montgomery and position himself as the defender of American honor, became even more vocal in his criticism. He told war correspondents that Montgomery had contributed nothing to the victory in the Bulge, that American forces had stopped the German offensive before Montgomery even arrived, and that Montgomery's press conference was typical of British attempts to steal credit for American achievements. He suggested that Third Army's rapid pivot from offensive operations in the South to counterattacking the German flank had been the crucial factor in stopping the offensive, and that Montgomery's methodical preparations in the North had actually delayed the final victory. Patton's comments were not entirely unfair. Third Army's performance during the Battle of the Bulge had been extraordinary. Patton had achieved what most military experts thought impossible, turning his entire army 90 degrees, moving it through winter weather on icy roads, and launching a coordinated attack against the German flank within 72 hours. His relief of the besieged American forces at Bastogne had become legendary. Third Army had inflicted enormous casualties on German forces attacking the southern flank of the Bulge. From a purely military standpoint, Patton's contribution to stopping the German offensive had been at least as important as Montgomery's, and probably more so. But Patton's public criticism of Montgomery, coming on top of Montgomery's disastrous press conference, threatened to turn a manageable controversy into a complete breakdown of the alliance. British newspapers began responding to American criticism with their own attacks, questioning American military competence and suggesting that without British assistance, American forces would have been defeated. British columnists brought up American failures at Kasserine Pass in North Africa and the difficulties in the Normandy hedgerows, suggesting that American forces were inexperienced and prone to panic. These articles, when reprinted in American newspapers, further inflamed American public opinion. By mid-January 1945, the crisis had reached Eisenhower's desk in a form that demanded immediate action. He was receiving reports that some American units were refusing to follow orders from British commanders, claiming that Montgomery's comments had forfeited his right to command American troops. British liaison officers reported that American commanders were being openly disrespectful in their dealings with British counterparts. The functioning of the alliance, the ability of British and American forces to coordinate operations, was breaking down at the working level because of the poisoned atmosphere created by Montgomery's press conference and the subsequent recriminations. Eisenhower understood that he had to act decisively to save the alliance. On January 17th, he returned 1st and 9th Armies to Bradley's command, ending the temporary arrangement that had been made during the Battle of the Bulge. This was presented as a return to normal command relationships now that the crisis had passed, but everyone understood that it was also a response to the uproar over Montgomery's press conference. Eisenhower was demonstrating that American commanders would control American armies, that the temporary expedient of the Bulge would not become permanent. But Eisenhower also knew that simply reversing the command change wasn't enough. He needed to address the fundamental breach in Anglo-American relations that had been exposed by this crisis. He called a meeting of his senior commanders, both American and British, to clear the air and re-establish working relationships. At this meeting, Eisenhower made clear that public criticism of allies would not be tolerated, that commanders who could not work within the coalition would be relieved regardless of their nationality or record, and that the alliance was more important than any individual ego or national pride. Eisenhower's specific message to Patton at this meeting was blunt. He told Patton that his public criticism of Montgomery and of the command arrangements during the Bulge were undermining the alliance and would cease immediately. He made clear that continued criticism would result in Patton's relief from command and return to the United States. For Patton, who had survived multiple scandals during the war because of his value as a combat commander, this was a wake-up call. Even Eisenhower's legendary patience had limits, and Patton had nearly reached them. Churchill's speech to the House of Commons on January 18th was carefully crafted to repair the damage done by Montgomery's press conference. Churchill lavished praise on American forces, describing their performance during the Battle of the Bulge as heroic and decisive. He specifically mentioned American commanders by name, including Bradley and Patton, crediting them with the victory. He described the battle as primarily an American achievement, fought mostly by American troops under American command. His praise of Montgomery was perfunctory and brief, making clear that Montgomery's role had been supporting rather than leading. The speech worked. American newspapers, which had been full of anti-British sentiment days earlier, published approving editorials about Churchill's gracious recognition of American contributions. The crisis in public opinion began to subside, but the damage to relationships between commanders had been done and would not be easily repaired. Bradley would never forgive Montgomery for the press conference, seeing it as typical of British arrogance and self-promotion. Montgomery, for his part, never really understood what he had done wrong, believing that he had simply stated facts about his role in the battle. Patton's role in the crisis revealed the dangerous double edge of his personality. On one hand, his rapid response during the Battle of the Bulge, his relief of Bastogne, and his aggressive prosecution of the counteroffensive had been genuinely heroic and strategically important. Without Third Army's performance, the Battle of the Bulge might have lasted longer and cost more lives. On the other hand, his willingness to publicly criticize Allied commanders, to fan the flames of Anglo-American rivalry, and to put his own ego and national pride ahead of alliance unity, had nearly destroyed the coalition at a crucial moment. What makes this crisis particularly significant is how close it actually came to breaking up the alliance. We know from documents declassified long after the war that serious discussions were held in Washington about whether to continue the Anglo-American partnership on current terms, or whether to demand a reorganization that would give American commanders more authority, commensurate with America's growing contribution of men and materiel. Some officials in the War Department argued that the Montgomery crisis proved that coalition warfare with the British was more trouble than it was worth, and that American forces should operate independently. Similar discussions were held in London, where some British military and political figures argued that the Americans were ungrateful and impossible to work with, that British strategic wisdom was being ignored in favor of American brute force approaches, and that perhaps Britain would be better off focusing on its own operations and letting the Americans learn from their own mistakes. These were dangerous discussions that, if they had led to actual policy changes, could have split the alliance and potentially prolonged the war. The German military intelligence services were monitoring the crisis closely, hoping that it signaled a genuine break in the alliance. German radio broadcasts played up the Anglo-American disagreements, suggesting that the alliance was on the verge of collapse and that Germany might yet achieve a separate peace with one side or the other. German commanders began to think about how they might exploit divisions between British and American forces, potentially concentrating against one while holding defensively against the other. The fact that the Germans saw opportunity in the crisis illustrates how serious it was. What ultimately saved the alliance was a combination of Churchill's diplomatic skill, Eisenhower's determination to maintain unity, and the recognition by leaders on both sides that they needed each other more than they needed to protect national pride. But it was a close call, closer than most people realized at the time. The alliance survived, but it was weakened by the episode. American commanders would be less willing to defer to British preferences in future strategic discussions. British commanders would be more careful about public statements, but also more resentful of what they saw as American sensitivity and inability to accept honest criticism. For Patton personally, the crisis was a missed opportunity to demonstrate the kind of leadership that goes beyond battlefield success. He could have been a voice for unity, using his credibility as a combat commander to calm American resentment and argue for the importance of the alliance. Instead, he fed the controversy, used it to settle personal scores with Bradley and Montgomery, and prioritized his own ego over alliance stability. This pattern of behavior, choosing personal gratification over institutional needs, would characterize Patton's final months and contribute to his eventual relief from command. The lessons from this crisis influenced how Allied operations were managed for the remainder of the war. Eisenhower became even more insistent on maintaining clear command relationships that respected national sensitivities. He avoided putting American forces under British command, except in the most extreme circumstances. He established protocols for public statements by senior commanders to prevent another Montgomery-style press conference. He became more active in managing the public relations aspects of the alliance, ensuring that credit for victories was distributed in ways that satisfied both American and British audiences. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the fragility of coalitions in war. Even when nations share common enemies and common goals, even when military logic clearly indicates the need for cooperation, national pride and personal ambition can threaten to tear alliances apart. The day Allied unity nearly collapsed in January 1945 was a reminder that winning the war required not just military skill, but diplomatic wisdom. Not just battlefield victories, but careful management of relationships and perceptions. Patton's centrality to this crisis illustrated both his importance to the war effort and his unreliability as a coalition partner. He was at the center of the crisis, both because his spectacular military performance made him newsworthy, and because his inability to control his public statements and his nationalistic resentments made him a source of controversy. A lesser commander, someone whose battlefield achievements were less impressive, could have been ignored or sidelined when he made inflammatory statements. But Patton's credibility as a combat leader gave his criticisms weight, making them more dangerous to alliance unity. Looking back from the perspective of decades later, with the full archives available and the perspective of time, we can see how serious this crisis actually was. The alliance held together, Germany was defeated, and the post-war order was established largely as the Western Allies intended. But it could easily have gone differently. If Montgomery had been more stubborn in defending his press conference comments, if American military leaders had made good on their threats to refuse cooperation with British commanders, if Churchill had been less skillful in his diplomatic intervention, if Eisenhower had been less committed to maintaining unity, the alliance could have fractured. And if the alliance had fractured in January 1945, the consequences would have been profound. The war would certainly have lasted longer, probably into 1946 or beyond. Casualties on both sides would have been much higher. The post-war division of Europe might have been very different, with the Soviet Union occupying even more territory, while British and American forces pursued separate operational objectives. The entire architecture of the post-war world, including NATO and the special relationship between Britain and the United States, might never have been built. The day Allied unity nearly collapsed was not a single day, but rather a period of about 2 weeks in January 1945, when the accumulated tensions of coalition warfare, triggered by Montgomery's ill-advised press conference and amplified by Patton's resentful criticism, brought the Anglo-American alliance to the breaking point. That the alliance survived was not inevitable, but was rather the result of conscious choices by leaders on both sides to prioritize victory over pride, unity over recrimination, and long-term strategic interests over short-term emotional satisfaction. Patton's role in this crisis, as the most vocal American critic of the command changes and of Montgomery's leadership, made him both a hero to Americans who resented British condescension and a threat to the alliance that was essential to winning the war. His inability to see beyond his personal grudges and national loyalties to the larger strategic picture showed the limitations of even great commanders when they operate outside their area of competence. Battlefield genius does not automatically translate to diplomatic wisdom, and Patton's performance during this crisis demonstrated that lesson as clearly as any episode in his controversial career. In the end, the alliance held, the war was won, and the crisis of January 1945 became a historical footnote rather than a turning point. But for those who lived through it, who felt the alliance shaking beneath their feet, who saw how close it came to collapse, The crisis was a terrifying reminder of how fragile international cooperation can be, even in the face of existential threats. And at the center of that crisis, for better and worse, was George Patton, whose brilliance on the battlefield was matched only by his capacity for creating chaos off it.